Well, hello everyone. This is Ryan Nakari here, and welcome to another episode of Talking with Teal, where we talk about all topics integral. And today I'm here with Bruce Alderman. So Bruce, how are you today?
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you so much for coming on. I'm really honored and really excited to be able to talk to you about all kind of things, and I really look forward to hearing more about the work you do and your background. And so to begin, can you just tell us a little bit about your life and how you got enmeshed in the integral movement?
Yeah, let's see. I could trace it back a long time ago, probably to my high school years. And I had not heard of integral theory at that point, but I had a number of things happen in my life that really caused me to question my existence, my purpose, and really set about a kind of a profound reorientation. There are a number of different tragedies and things that happened in the high school years. And I had an opportunity to go on a retreat, which opened me to I don't know how to put it, but an encounter with my own depths and with a presence that was beyond me at the same time, that really inspired me to take stock of my life and reorient, and in spite of the things that were going on, to really commit to something. And that opened up into a spiritual search, and over many years it ultimately culminated in a trip to Asia, where I spent a number of years in different monasteries and ashrams. And after returning to the US, I felt inspired to try to integrate that experience with my life here in the US, and organize a career around that, or organize at least a life way around that. And I did not, in my earlier years, in my young 20s, late teens and young 20s, I had flirted with the idea of a monastic vocation. I no longer felt that I wanted to do that. I loved being out in the world too much and wanted a family. But I found a degree program at a university where I actually am now working and teaching, that I felt would allow me to integrate that past contemplative experience with Western knowledge and ways of helping psychotherapeutically. And so I got enrolled in a transpersonal psychology counseling program first, and then an integral psychology program became available. So I ended up doing essentially a double master's degree in transpersonal counseling psychology and integral psychology. And that probably is my formal entrance into the integral world. Throughout that time, actually as students in this program, we were allowed to go for a summer meeting at Ken Wilber's house. Our cohort would go there and spend the weekend with him and talk to him about different topics, and he would give some teachings, and a lot of it was just open for back and forth question and inquiry. And at that meeting, it was announced that they were about to open up what they call Integral Naked, the online presence, one of the first online forum and multimedia spaces for the integral movement that's around Ken Wilber. And so I got involved in that right away, and have been really participating in integral spaces online since that time.
Wow, yeah. And so this was at JFK that you did the psychology program?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And so when you were exploring all of these monastic traditions and spiritual traditions in Asia, what traditions were you studying and practicing?
I first started out in working in Korea as an English teacher. And while there, I also studied Sun Buddhism, and would visit temples and do an occasional retreat. After I left Korea, I went to Indonesia for a year. And I lived for 1 year at a Vipassana ashram. They called it an ashram So there's a little bit of a Hindu influence there as well. But yeah, it was a Javanese style Vipassana. And so I studied that for a year while living at that center. It was called Shanti Loka. And basically it was a wonderful deal. I arrived in Indonesia just wanting to study music and also looking for a place to live. And I found out that there was this place called Shanti Loka where basically they gave you free room if you agreed to go to meditation teachings every night. I said that was a wonderful deal. They had a huge library of spiritual books, and I was able to practice Vipassana every evening. And through that time in the ashram in Java, occasionally he would encourage deeper dives. So I would go over to Malaysia or Thailand and do intensive retreats from time to time, the 10-day or 30-day immersive retreats, especially on Penang Island near Malaysia. And then finishing there, I went to India and I volunteered as a creative writing teacher at a Krishnamurti school in India and was able to teach classes there, but also study a great deal and participate in contemplative dialogues, and particularly around Krishnamurti's teachings. And he famously doesn't have methods really, but he did have types of inquiry he encouraged and I would pursue, mostly involving just watching the movement of thought and attending to how perception is influenced by conditioning and trying to cut through some of those patterns. But during that time also, I actually had opportunity, occasionally Tibetan lamas from Sarnath, which was not far. I could walk from where I was over to Sarnath, about an hour walk. Those lamas from a major Tibetan learning center and university in Sarnath would come to the Krishnamurti Center and give talks. So I began to be exposed more to Tibetan teachings as well. And at one point had a very strong dream, kind of encounter with a Tibetan Lama, and that inspired me to take a trip up to Nepal. And there I was able to meet with some teachers, especially in the Nyingma tradition, and in primarily focusing on Dzogchen or the Kagyu Mahamudra teachings. And so I was able to receive a number of teachings with Dzogchen and Mahamudra up in Nepal.
Wow, that's a remarkable journey and kind of like a lifetime of experience and immersion to these traditions. And you had such an exposure to a whole cornucopia of these traditional Eastern lineages. And when you came back to the West and went to graduate school and were exposed to integral theory, what was it about integral that kind of hooked you into integral? Like what was it that you said, this is really something I'm interested in?
Years before that, when I was especially interested in Krishnamurti's teachings, I would occasionally come across a Ken Wilber book in a bookstore, and I hated them. I would look at them and see all the charts in there and think, this is ridiculous. What's he doing trying to chart spirit? This doesn't make sense. It's all in the head. And I didn't like it, so I wouldn't read those books. But after being on that journey, especially at the Krishnamurti Center in India, where I really practiced, both in Vipassana, but more at the Krishnamurti Center, I really practiced a very spare way of spiritual living, where I wasn't doing ritual or engaging with mythology or story or anything, even though I was a creative writing major and I loved mythology and poetry and fiction. At that time, I was really just trying to strip down and be very bare and spare in how I approached my inquiry. And towards the end of that year at the Krishnamurti Center, I found myself hungry to engage with the multiple streams of human meaning making and the ways that they showed up in narrative and poetry and myth and tradition and practice. And while I found there was great value in the kind of inquiry I did at the Krishnamurti Center, it also kind of pushed me through to a point that I saw that there actually wasn't anything inherently binding in those, traditional streams. The binding had to do with your own approach to it, how you would hold it, how you would relate to it, and it wasn't any fault of those particular traditions. And I really felt I wanted to be immersed in that deep time dialogue with human experience. And so when I came back to the US, I was house sitting someplace and somebody had a Ken Wilber book on the shelf. I picked it up again, and this time it just sang to me because I could now see what he was doing. I could see, the multiple streams that now I had been immersed in, how he was tracing, resonances and echoes between them and trying to find a way to say yes multiply to them instead of the ways that often spiritual practitioners divide into camps against one another, and that I didn't feel from my own experience was justified. So I really saw in him a promise of pooling that experience into a coherent view and a way of practice. And so I couldn't find at the time any school that directly dealt with his work as a degree, but the transpersonal psychology program at JFKU seemed close because they did involve Ken Wilber's material in the courses. And so I joined for that reason. And then when I found out when I was almost finished, they opened up an integral psychology program. I said, hey, you can't do that to me. So they let me stay on for 1 year and take some integral psychology courses as well.
Yeah, that's really funny. So how did this kind of lead to your involvement with online integral work and community, and eventually also you as the what's your title here, the acting chair of the Consciousness and Transformative Studies program at JFK?
At first, I was just a forum participant. I really enjoyed dialoguing on Integral Naked and later the Integral Multiplex and Integral Life web platforms. And mostly I was just a participant there. When Ken Wilber, I think, published his book, Integral Spirituality, at that time I wanted to start a book study around it. So I created a forum called Integral Post-Metaphysical Spirituality and started kind of experimenting with being a host of the online forum. And that took off, and it took off in directions that I hadn't anticipated. It was much more than a book study. It really became an online learning platform to really understand all the streams that Wilber was drawing from for, what's involved in an integrative view, what is post-metaphysics. And it took me and other participants well outside of just reading Ken Wilber books into reading a lot of the source materials. And it became a platform really for self-education in Western and Eastern philosophy. I've been reading Eastern philosophy for a long time, and I'd always kind of looked down on Western philosophy as inferior. But now I began to engage it and actually found a lot of depth and beauty there as well. And so that just eventually flowered into me operating a couple online platforms. So that was kind of the online side of that. Mm-hmm. And parallel to that, after graduating from JFKU, I actually was attending a Diamond Approach meeting, Almas's Diamond Approach, because I used to do Diamond Approach for about 5 years. And at one of those meetings, we were speaking about kind of like value and heart's purpose. And I just spoke about, my vision for my life and my heart purpose. And somebody from JFK was there and called me up after the meeting and said, we want you to come back to JFK and teach here. So I began teaching, I think 2007, and have been teaching as an adjunct faculty here for, since then, about 12 years. And it's only in the last month and a half or 2 months that I've moved into this position of acting chair for this program. And acting chair means I'm not permanently in this position. The chair is away on much deserved sabbatical, and I'm basically sitting in for her and practicing in this role, so maybe I can eventually take on more responsibility here at JFK in the long term.
I see. So a practice of impermanence.
Exactly.
But congratulations. I mean, that sounds like a dream career for you. I mean, having eventually led to this, and yeah,
I'm really honored. I really think that there are a couple schools out here, in the world like JFKU, but not that many. And I feel really blessed to be part of a community like this that's dedicated to these topics, and where there's usually such high caliber among the students, people who are really serious about both growing themselves and making a positive impact on the world.
Yeah. I remember when I was several years ago, I was checking out JFK and had a lot of interest in their programs, and seemed very resonant with a lot of my interests in terms of higher education and consciousness and so forth. So let's talk a little bit about the integral post-metaphysical forum and community that you had built. And I checked it out, and it's very densely packed, philosophically rich, and very robust, material and concepts floating around there. So can you just give us a little snapshot, what it is, and kind of what are your goals with that community and what you guys are chewing into?
Right. That forum has always been relatively dense and focused. It's really for the geeks and the nerds in the integral world to dive in. And I think it has, in my own life, it has to be held in some balance with other things, because our discussions there can be heady and very intellectual and abstract. And those things have been useful for me. I see, I don't follow some of the lines of New Age spiritual thinking or whatever that sees the intellect as a barrier to spiritual understanding. I think it can be, but not necessarily. And I think it can also be its own kind of yoga, its own kind of way of refining consciousness, and, followed deeply enough, it can open up into some transformative insights. It doesn't have to be separate. But rather unapologetically, we really intended for that space to be for anyone interested in diving deeply into the sources behind integral philosophy and the whole movement of post-metaphysics in the West, and whatever echoes of that there are in the East. And I've seen it, even though no one's going to count it that way, I've seen it in a sense as our own self-generated PhD program, in that it involved us in pretty extensive reading and exploration of a wide range of literature related to this topic on philosophy, on hermeneutics, the whole range of epistemological explorations. Eventually, it opened up into a whole range of ontological explorations, and we gave a lot of time to exploring, for instance, the speculative realism and object-oriented ontology, some of the new movements in ontology which are recovering metaphysics after the post-metaphysical turn, and finding really a new valuation of that project that kind of folds in the insights of post-modernity and yet can still play the metaphysical game. So that's been part of it. And we are less active, I would say, now than a few years ago, when we had really pretty intense and regular activity. But there are still flames burning and still threads going there. As you saw in the material I shared with you, it did eventually result in a special issue of Integral Review, where we pulled some of the themes that we regularly explored on the forum together into a handful of essays, just to capture some of the core thoughts and insights and kind of conclusions that we came to in our work there, that wouldn't involve reading through hundreds and hundreds of threads, kind of a condensing of some of that material. One of the ideas with this actually is, and we've kind of run into some resistance with it. One thread that we've wanted to follow here, and that we think is consistent with Teal or second tier orientation, is a commons-based or a P2P orientation. There are roots in the peer-to-peer movement in green, but I think it really flowers more fully in second tier. And there sometimes in the academic world is disparagement of the blog world or the forum world as subpar, that there's no real inquiry going on there, there's no real scholarship going on there. But some of the authors that we explored there are actually following the new P2P, peer-to-peer ethos, in that they're writing books which they make available for free to anyone who wants to download them, and they sell them through regular platforms. And they also blog and interact with the public in a much more active way than academics usually do. And so that's really what we wanted this space to be, is a peer-to-peer learning space for scholar practitioners, for people who are interested in diving deeply intellectually and engaging in spiritual practice, and creating a platform where I think real work, questioning, formulation of conclusions can take place, even though they're not peer-reviewed and published yet. That's another phase, and we can take it that direction. But we wanted that space to be for that kind of work, and really to validate that kind of space as valuable, for academic work and spiritual contemplative work, not just chatting, as people tend to see, or ranting, or whatever people usually see as the forums for.
Right. Having a more kind of holistic container of collaboration and mind sharing, or other things that they call it these days. Taking advantage of the internet and all of its capacities to do that.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, you had mentioned object-oriented ontology and other kind of philosophies that you had studied, and I'm just curious. I guess I'll frame the question this way: if someone is a integral, enthusiast and Wilber reader, but hasn't dug into these more dense, abstract, kind of neo-Heideggerian or Whiteheadian stuff that's can be very heady for some people, can you just kind of distill for us some of the core nuggets or insights of how some of these insights from these philosophies and from some of this consciousness literature can enrich our understanding of integral theory or second tier? Maybe Wilber hasn't gone as deep into these guys as you did on this forum. So how could a more integral kind of layman be there? How can their understanding of integral be enriched by these concepts that you've explored?
Right. I think, exploring Heidegger and or some post-Heideggerian philosophers, Habermas or Sloterdijk or David Michael Levin, all of them. One of the things that Wilber's Integral Spirituality book is organized around is kind of a critique of the myth of the given. And that involves kind of a critique of the way that the perennial philosophy is often framed as this, pre-given layers of reality that we just interface with, and that are there independent of our development or our perspective. And so he gives a good snapshot idea of a critique of the myth of the given, but really there's a lot more subtlety and depth to what's going on with that critique. Overall, a critique of the metaphysics of presence, which you will find in Derrida, in Heidegger, in David Michael Levin. And David Michael Levin really takes it far and in some beautiful ways. If you're interested, one of the things that is emerging now out of cognitive science, if you study the work of Lakoff and Johnson, for instance, their book Philosophy in the Flesh, there's really a potential revolution there in seeing how rooted are many of our, in fact, most of our both concrete but also very abstract concepts are all rooted in the body and in embodiment and embodied image schemas. And if you're interested in postmetaphysics, which is really challenging the idea of these abstract ethereal structures existing out there in the universe independent of us and independent of our perception, and you really are taking on board these ideas of enactment and co-construction of experience, then the whole influence of the body on the construction of perception and the way that we organize the world and what we take to be the core organizing principles or metaphors are all rooted in embodied image schema. So I mention that because David Michael Levin has a series of books which explores the different human senses. And he has a book related to body and touch, and one related to vision, one related to listening, one related to the voice. And in each one of them, he goes through a developmental progression of looking at how, as infants, we inhabit that sensory world in a particular way, how our senses get shaped and structured by our socialization, and then how education gradually teaches us to challenge and make transparent some of that socialization so that we can begin to see how we've been conditioned to see in a particular way or to listen in a particular way, especially that has political connotations. Do we see or listen to others based on biases or prejudices, unconscious social and in personal shadow? The ways that we relate to women or to people from other ethnic backgrounds or races or whatever. All of those things structure. So that's part of the critical thinking that we learn through education. And he explores how that shows up in the way that we see and that we listen. But then he takes it further into how there can be a kind of recovery of the early infantile immersive sense in an unbounded sensory mode, but reclaimed at a higher level and from a different perspective that really relates to vision logic and actually holistic spiritual perception. So he himself went through a Dzogchen dark retreat and practices Zen and practices time-space knowledge. So he's an academic Western philosopher, but he's also immersing himself in these practice traditions and showing how we can deeply explore any one of the senses and open them up towards a more spiritually, both more politically awake or woke orientation, as well as a more spiritually open and realized one. So that's just an example of all of those streams are not Wilberian, but they're very complementary to what Wilber is talking about with enactment and with the kind of tetra enactment of how society and body and culture and psyche and shadow and all those things work together to form the gestalt of whatever we're experiencing. Object-oriented ontology, there's Wilber, in the way he frames the book, frames ontology and metaphysics in integral spirituality, kind of denigrates metaphysics. And so at first, when we were first starting out this inquiry in the forum, we were all kind of worried about being metaphysical. We don't want to be metaphysical. We want to be post-metaphysical, And actually, through that inquiry, we found you can't get away from metaphysics. You really can't. There are always going to be, and I think Gödel it shows us that too in the incompleteness theorem, that there are always aspects of your worldview that have to be taken for granted in some sense as part of the foundational structure, that are not, that are potentially open to inquiry, but that, that need to be taken as given for, the time being. And so it kind of opened us back up to re-embracing metaphysical and ontological exploration as a form of creative play, not as something that you just take for granted or that you're unconsciously stuck in. Post-metaphysics calls you to continually hold your world making in question, but I think it allows our exposure to object-oriented ontology, which is, it just says, object-oriented ontology just says, let's just, where postmodernism said we have to bracket out any ontological claims, let's just sidestep that and let's just make ontological claims and see what happens to our experience, see what happens to the way that we engage with the world. So it becomes a way of creative play to say, okay, if I take this as given, what changes in my perception? What newly can I see? What was shadowed before that now becomes open to me? And so then metaphysics becomes a tool in the practice of experiential inquiry.
Wow, that may have been the most inspiring framing of metaphysics I've ever I've ever heard. It's almost dawning different kind of lenses or perceptions of reality and questioning these given implicit assumptions and just seeing how that changes things and to what degree does our own subjective perception or perspective really shape our reality. And I don't know if you're familiar with Grant Maxwell.
Yes.
I just read his book, and that was kind of the main theme of it. There are all these movements. He mentioned all these guys, Whitehead, Jung, and fractals and all these things. And the main theme of all of it is this kind of post-metaphysical view where reality is more. It has that kind of fluidity. It's not at the postmodern extreme, but the interaction between the sphere of our subjectivity and objective reality are more porous than this kind of hard line.
Yeah.
And you can play with that.
Exactly. Yeah, and I want to say, I saw that book. I got excited by that book. I read one chapter of that book and liked it, and I haven't been able to go back to it just because with my responsibilities nowadays, I can hardly do my own pleasure reading. But I'm glad to hear you say that because it's a good push for me to keep making time for that book because I was excited to see that when it came out. It looks like a really promising exploration. Grant Maxwell's book, I mean.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, one of my main interests in it was I guess he's kind of like a Gibbserian, so he kind of brings that Gibbserian perspective of emphasizing time in the integral stage,
right.
And that he integrates a lot of Jungian archetypes and everything. So it's a lot of fun.
Cool.
So out of all of this, how did you start the integral stage, and kind of what were you trying to birth with that initiative?
Honestly, it started with a different idea. There were a number of conflicts going on between integral forums and some contention among members of different forums over different issues. And I wanted to create a space where there could be some dialogue and debate around some of those hot issues that would be relatively neutral, because if people in different forums are aligning in different camps against each other, then to hold the debate or dialogue in any one of those spaces already is kind of slanting in one way or the other. So I wanted to create kind of a neutral space that would be a place for those kind of debates and even knockdown dragouts to take place. But as I really started thinking about it, it started to seem like this was an opportunity to do something else. And so I felt and feel now that really the integral community is full of a lot of really creative thinking, a lot of branching out in different ways or applications of integral theory, or sometimes you could say, post-integral theorizing and work that I think really deserves to be highlighted for the community. That, in many, contexts where there's formal media, we're mostly listening to the thought leaders, right? The recognized thought leaders who are the main, teachers and workshop givers and everything out there. And I love that. That's great. And, I really like what Corey is doing with Ken and the Ken Show. I love the pun there too.
Right.
But those are, really nice dialogues, and I really enjoy that. But I really felt that there's room, especially in our multimedia age now, where people sometimes want to listen to something or see something instead of sit down and read something, that we could create a space where we could give room for more voices to share, what their work is and what they're going on. And I think to create more of a sense of community and shared inquiry and engagement that transcends what happens in the written form, which can often magnify misunderstandings or can be unfocused and wandering. So I just thought that the constraints of setting this up as a platform where we really organize, structured dialogues, inquiries, and debates, and that we can also highlight the creative and intellectual and spiritual work that a lot of the community members are doing. I just thought that the time is right for that. And the group is still relatively small, but there does seem to be interest. And today, and actually this week, I'm meeting probably 6 times with people to record different media content for the integral stage. So there's a lot of activity happening around it, and I'm hopeful that it'll keep growing.
That's so funny, and this is getting me really excited because I had everything you said, from wanting to capture some of the creative work people are doing and giving voice to the non-cultural luminaries and integral, right, to the regular folks doing interesting things, and to provide this kind of neutral debate stage to have a face-to-face discussion about these things, these conflicts that are happening on forums. And it's like that I've had all the same ideas. I mean, I started this podcast to try to capture what people are doing. I started the Integral Crossfire program every Thursday. I'm not doing it anymore because I have to work. I got a new job. But I had all the same ideas. It's so cool to see us thinking so similarly. Just to give us an example, can you kind of paint a picture of what some of these conflicts on the forums, what were they about, and what forums were these on?
One of the main sources of conflict was one forum that I moderate called ERPI's Integral Forum, or actually ERPI's Integral Saloon. And it's kind of a Wild West place. And some people in other integral forums, are concerned about activities that are taking place on ERPI's. And people on ERPI's are also critical of some of what's going on in other forums. It's a long story. Mainly, there were a lot of conflicts that broke out among people on the Integral Global Forum. And there were complaints about, I think they fell along the lines of people who were more liberal-leaning or more conservative-leaning, at least in perception, among the different members of Integral Global. Some people were more inclined towards conspiracy types of thinking, and others were not. And one individual who had been becoming more critical of some of the mainstream thought in Integral, just voiced in an offhand way, I wish there was a forum that was just no holds barred, totally free, without moderation, in a way that, Integral Global wasn't being moderated very much, but everyone was expecting there to be moderation, and so that was magnifying kind of the conflicts. And so this person just made the joke, I wish there was just a place that was just like a free form place. It's going to self-destruct, but why don't we try it? And so just as a joke, I made a forum just to show to him. And I based it on Ken Wilber's old rant against his critics, where he called himself Wyatt Earp. And I don't know if you're aware of that, but that happened, more than 10 years ago. And he used some caustic language, and it was a controversial moment in the way that he expressed himself. And I actually was not really a fan of how he handled the critics in that blog, but I used that as a theme and chose the Wild West theme and started this group, and we anticipated that it would rapidly crash or fail. But it didn't. It just kept growing and remaining active. But it has attracted people who are mostly, I would say, post-leftist, that they were liberal-leaning, but eventually became critical, at least of some aspects of what's going on in the Democratic or liberal-leaning parties as hypocritical or ineffective or whatever. And most of the members there are not people who share my own political views, but I thought as it kept going and taking its own shape and forming its own culture, that it's worth having a space where that kind of inquiry can go on, and that it's not perceived as disruptive to all the other forums that don't want that kind of inquiry. And so that's basically it, is that, that space is, it's a private group and it's a small group, but some people have been critical in other forums about, the modes of expression, because there's no moderation there, so people insult each other and play with each other, and it's meant to be, from my side and the way I set it up, all kind of a tongue-in-cheek play, not to be really seriously bad or evil to each other, but to just be a little bit more raucous and in a spirit of goodwill. But sometimes, because it's not that moderated, it can get out of hand, and some things have been more conflictual than I think they than is needed or healthy. So there's been some legitimate critique of the forum, but there's also been, I think, some exaggerated fear that it's something that it's not. And so, that's been the main source. There have been people on the outside saying that the group should be shut down, and they aren't often, it's been difficult to help the sides communicate with each other. So I thought creating a space initially where the different sides could communicate with each other over the contentious ideas in a neutral space, that would be valuable. I still think so, and I'm still open to doing that on the integral stage, but the integral stage now to me has become something else in terms of more broadly interested in just tapping into all the creative work that's happening in the integral community, like I mentioned before.
I see. So do you still plan on having this kind of meta stage platform for different communities to meet on the neutral space to debate, or is that not going to be part of the integral stage anymore?
I'm not certain, but I think I'm going to try it on the integral stage. I want to do it and see if we can do it in a way that's constructive. And it, I don't want it, I don't want the overall atmosphere and feeling of, the integral stage to be disrupted if there's too much contentiousness and rancor or anything like that. But if it can be handled in a constructive way, which is what I'd really love, and to promote kind of understanding on both sides and maybe increase some reciprocal respect, I would like that. And where there are real critiques that can actually land, I think that's valuable, So I may still do it, but I'm kind of approaching it gently, letting integral stage find its legs first before it gets into more difficult stuff.
That's probably a good idea. Yeah, I don't have any background on moderating debates or anything, but when I started Crossfire, that was basically the idea, and it was hard to schedule one-on-one debates, so we've been more doing like group discussions on controversial topics, which has been a lot of fun. So I'm curious, I mean, because I know that you talked about the polarity debate format, which I really like. But as an integral thinker, how do we structure these debates in a kind of integral way, and how do you moderate them in an integral way?
It's not easy. The way that we're doing the polarity dialogue right now is not really the full way that it would be done. For instance, in like conflict mediation, we're just both stating our own individual positive and negative takes on a topic without necessarily engaging the other's position until the dialogue at the end. Another way that it can be handled that is used more often, that I think does have integrative potential, is for the participants to have a couple rounds of speaking, but this time they will, one, state their own perspective, then they will state what they value about the other side's perspective, then they will state what they think the weaknesses are of their own perspective, and where they feel like it really is open to critique or that it has some weak spots, and then they will state what they think is wrong with their partner's perspective. So it's really, 8 rounds. Each person speaks from 4 perspectives, and they gradually, move through that until the end, where they've both been able. They first have to be able to actually articulate the other side's perspective to the satisfaction of the other side. To say, this is what I think you're doing, and this is what I think is valuable, and the other side has to be able to recognize themselves in your description, and you need to kind of do some work if they say you're straw manning, or that you can't really you can't really take that perspective and have it stand as representative of my side, right? So I think if you go through that process, I think that can be valuable, and it could be done in a single sitting, or it might be done over a bit of time with some videos produced or audio produced, where they each will go back and forth over like a week or 2 week period. So I think that's something I'd like to experiment with. Something else that we have considered is the thing I was calling the Steelman debates, which is basically just a challenge. Actually, it's just a portion of this polarity dialogue, which would just be 2 sides are conflicting over an issue, and basically each side has to argue the other side convincingly, and they try to defeat each other from the opposite side of the position that they hold. And I think just that exercise alone can be really instructive. If you can really, it's like a kind of shadow work. If you can really stand inside the other's perspective to a degree that you can enact it in a convincing way and actually go for the win, still cultivate that kind of like edgy spirit there. But from the opposite side, I think that itself can be, personally illuminating and can help, highlight your own presuppositions in a way, and your own capacity to see from the other side. So that's a dialogue that we want to try with. The polarity dialogue that we're doing right now kind of plays with that, but not it doesn't quite go far enough. So that's another method maybe.
Wow. I mean, what's so exciting for me is I've always thought about how to structure communication or just dialogue in a certain way that would that would force us into integral consciousness, basically. This sounds like really the right way to do that. And my background, Bruce, is I've been trained in mediation and conflict resolution and facilitation. So what we're trained to do is, whenever someone says anything, you try to reframe it in a way where it captures the positive underlying value or needs or identity that's at stake. So even if someone's a Nazi and says all Jews must die, there's still an opportunity to reframe that into an underlying value system that may be coming out in a very messed up, kind of odious way. But if you can get to the underlying thing, then you can steel man and you can actually incorporate that. So my attitude towards debate has always been, as a student of integral, has always been, I'm going to reframe what you're saying from unhealthy into healthy, and then subsume you into me. I'm going to absorb your perspective into a larger whole.
Yes.
But I really realize that is really a skill that, just to be real, like a lot of people don't have that ability, and it really takes a lot. I've been fortunate enough to be trained by the city in how to do that, but
right.
To be able to train people to apply their integral consciousness in an interpersonal or communicative fashion, I think that's what is most inspiring to me as the next step the integral community can take.
I think so. That's wonderful to learn about your background. That's great. And I had actually seen some Crossfire episodes before, but I didn't remember that it was you. So that's so cool. Or encountered Crossfire episodes before, and I feel it is hard to do that fully as a process, and even some of the core members of the integral stage right now, it'll remain to be seen how well we can enact it. We're definitely going to try, and we're beginning to do that with like the polarity dialogue, but it can go farther, and one reason why it hasn't happened yet in terms like the Steelman dialogue is that honestly it is hard to find people that you have a lot of confidence that are really going to be able to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's worth attempting. And one of the things that's I'm sure with your background too is probably similar. It's really frustrating to watch most mass media, which is framed around polarization and talking points and cheap wins and maximizing conflict for profit and all of those things that are just non-productive. And I've always dreamed of something like a cable station or something where there would be an opportunity to model a different kind of communication and exchange and exploration. And so that's part of my inspiration behind, Integral Stage, is to maybe, slowly build that kind of platform. And, I think ultimately training is very helpful in that. But I think if there could just be a platform, a medium that enacts that and demonstrates that, that's already a teaching device. The more that we can begin to enact those kinds of dialogues and have them out there for the public, I think the more that they can be, normalized and then ultimately refined and strengthened and bring more people into that mode of interacting.
That's exactly another one of my purposes with Crossfire, was a way to model to the larger public and community how this could be done and set an example. And one of my dreams I've always had was to run an integral political campaign or presidential campaign, just to get someone like that on the debate stage to do that. And I've discovered that Andrew Yang is pretty much already doing that. So
I love Andrew Yang.
Yeah. He to me is like his ability to kind of acknowledge people's concerns and his way that he talks is, I think, a great demonstration of that.
Yes. Yeah. I have been in, I don't know how well he's going to ultimately do in terms of getting the recognition he needs, but he's one of the candidates I'm really most excited about. I really like the way he's expressing himself and the way he approaches ideas. And, if he doesn't make it this time, I hope he keeps going and tries again. So,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm actually volunteering at his rally in Portland this weekend. But
Great.
in terms of the topics for these debates or conversations or between these communities that had some contention, what are some of the hottest topics you see in the integral world that arouse the most controversy and passion behind them?
I think one is really the disagreement over the value of what's going on in the more, I would say, extreme ends of the progressive movement, where you see, the social justice warriors in the activity, or where you see even something like Antifa, and or things that have been happening like at Evergreen College in Oregon. Are you familiar with what happened there?
Yeah. What are you thinking about exactly at Evergreen?
Basically, I think it was Brett Weinstein.
That's right.
With what would happen with him, and there was a lot of concern about, I think they had, declared that on a particular day, where normally there were protests that people of color or minorities would choose not to come to campus as a form of social protest. On this day, they declared that white people can't come to campus. This is a no whites day. And he protested against that. He says, I'm totally your ally, but you shouldn't frame a movement around barring people, right, of any background. And that put him on the outs with a lot of the, progressive students there, and it got pretty heated. So there's been, critique, especially among members in ERPI's Integral Saloon, of kind of the more radical ends of what's going on the left, and them considering that more dangerous than what's going on the right. And whether that's true or not, I think there's a lot of bad stuff going on the right, but I think they have a valid point to critique some of that, and I want to allow a platform for that, for them to look at that. So questions around that, or questions around especially third wave feminism. What's happening with third wave feminism, and has feminism lost its way in its more radical forms of expression? And so definitely the people on ERPI's think it has, and some members of some of the other integral forums think that that's being blown out of proportion, and that that there's still a great deal of value in feminism, and would still want to defend a feminist agenda. So there's basically, I'd say, and whether there are legitimate complaints about men and men's issues, and how men are growing up in this society, especially, are they, is their development being compromised by postmodernism and some of the political correct framings of masculinity as almost intrinsically toxic? So that's kind of, where some of the debates have been around are gender issues, and around left-right, political divides, and the extremism on either side, whether it's the alt-right or the woke left or the alt-woke left. And so that's where I've seen the most contention. And there are other issues, related to, like, for instance, the value of nationalism, or, around issues related to immigration, and what are the proper, stances regarding, immigration and protection of boundaries versus, maximal cultivation of multicultural flowering. So a lot of tension there in how that gets enacted and what gets valued.
You know, it's so interesting hearing this because I kind of have a mixed reaction to all of this. Because on one hand, I'm kind of excited because it gives an opportunity for debate, and I love to keep that energy going, right, as a kind of creative catalyst of difference. At the same time, it kind of seems like the culture wars really still have seeped into the integral community.
Yeah.
And to a degree, there part of me feels kind of disappointed about that because I've always kind of thought, you know, at least ideally, that integral movement would be kind of trans culture war. We kind of have a bigger perspective where we can kind of see it and kind of, you know, see the good and bad. But it's still, I was surprised meeting a lot of integralists, and some of them are super left wing, and some of them are super right wing. And I was still kind of like, oh, I thought we were supposed to be above this, you know. I mean, that was ignorant of me to think, you know, but I still kind of had that assumption.
I think it's really, you know, I think it's really true that the divisiveness in the culture has definitely, you know, informed, especially, I didn't feel this quite so much, you know, 6 years ago or 10 years ago, as I do now in the integral community. So it definitely has influenced. I don't know if there's been, you know, if this is a change, or if this is just highlighting things that were implicit but never really fully voiced. You know, differences that were there but were not really fully voiced because people were more focused on the model and the abstract, and it wasn't really fully coming out, or whether there's actually been kind of a change of perspective that's been influenced by what's going on in the media. I don't know. Maybe it's a little of both. I definitely personally also hope for some degree of ability to rise above that sectarianism and that polarization. And what I do see on both sides is still almost an unwillingness to listen to the other. Sometimes for justified reasons, but sometimes not. You know, one of the reasons that I hear that, you know, on the right-wing side, I've always considered myself left-wing, but I'm hearing the right-wing a lot in the ERPES forum, is that one member particularly expresses it as a lack of reciprocity in dialogue that that he and some others have experienced, that, you know, for a long time they've taken the left-wing perspective themselves, but when they try to bring in any right-wing perspective, it's almost immediately shut down as regressive, as intrinsically wrong. And, you know, there's been experienced an inability to kind of like suspend presuppositions long enough to listen past what you think the associations are with that in order to hear something else. And so on the side of the member I'm thinking about in particular, now he's doing the same thing. He says, okay, I'm just not going to listen to them anymore. And just door closed. I'm just going to do my own work, you know. And I totally understand the justification for that. But long term, for the health of our movement, I don't think it's the right way to go. I totally understand it as a personal decision, and he wants to focus on his own stuff, and that's totally good. But as a way forward for the community to build cohesion and a broader view, it won't work if we keep shutting the door and blocking each other and that kind of thing. So I hope that while it can be messy, what your kinds of projects or mine can be platforms where, you know, some of those gaps can be bridged, hopefully.
And it's funny, I think we need to start within the integral community. I mean, ideally, that should be the easiest. And my kind of other vision and inspiration was to have kind of like an integral representative or ambassador who even goes to other communities online or in person and just kind of dialogues with them. And I know some communities on Facebook who are not very familiar with like spiral dynamics or the developmental stages model are very critical of the hierarchy. And so being able, I was even trying to invite them onto Crossfire, and then it would force us to not use integral lingo, right? Because we have to talk to a non-integral person. So it's another challenge of translating that and taking their perspective and making it work for them, you know. But I think starting with the integral community is probably a good idea, just to kind of shore up some of these fractures and divisions, and kind of see what comes out of that. And I also love to talk to people who really felt frustrated and shut out of the conversation, and just listen to them and just acknowledge them. And I mean, I do that on the phone. Like right before I came on here, I was talking to a person in the office for an hour because of all the things in their life. And so I'm used to people swearing at me and being really mad at, so it's like, yeah, like I kind of, my heart kind of goes out to those people in hopes that they can kind of be heard and acknowledged.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that's, while it's maybe in some measure disappointing that the culture of wars have, invaded integral spaces so much, at the same time, it provides really a good practice opportunity. Since these divisions are here and we do understand each other in terms of like basic language, we can practice trying to meet each other. But I totally agree with the value of venturing out of these, kind of selective circles and interacting with the larger world if we really want to be culturally effective. And so I think that's a wonderful idea and project. And, Marilyn Hamilton, talks about her idea of mesh working and of integral practitioners being people who are skilled at navigating between between networks and hierarchies and facilitating new connections. And that includes, serving as a kind of, as I think you've been trained in, a kind of mediary between, polarized groups or people with just different, presuppositions and expectations and purposes, where groups are working at some cross purpose or failing to communicate. So mesh worker is, a person who will get out there and it doesn't necessarily require the two people to even sit face to face and agree with each other. If the mesh worker can translate between the groups and broker some kind of agreement, that might not be possible if they were face to face. So that's one way of working, but the other is, actually to facilitate, dialogical and other kinds of deep listening processes, across these groups. I think there's the Global Dialogue Institute. Are you familiar with that?
No.
I think Ashok Gangadine is associated with that, and one other gentleman, I forgot his name, but they do a lot of work promoting interreligious and intercultural dialogue and encounters. Ashok Gangadine, or actually the Global Dialogue Institute, has a document that I use in my classes, which outlines the 7 stages of deep dialogue. And it takes people through, or it outlines the kind of shifts that people go through as they encounter significant difference and learn to negotiate boundaries between their worldview and the other worldview, and what happens when you begin to incorporate, some of what you encounter in the other. And, so until ultimately you emerge in what they would call a global ecological dialogical consciousness, where you find yourself immersed in a whole ecology of worldviews and better able to navigate among them and to make meaning in a multicentric kind of way. So yeah, I think that those kinds of things are really valuable and needed in our time. They not too long ago, they did an experiment of bringing some Saudi religious scholars to stay over in the United States with an Amish-like community and dialogue with them. And by the end of that process, both the Christians and the Muslims were so impressed with what they discovered in one another, where before they considered themselves each other natural enemies, that it was a real beautiful success, in the process that they took them through. And, I'm really interested in that kind of work.
Have you heard of the organization called Better Angels?
No.
It's I'm currently being trained as a moderator and facilitator with them, but they basically bring conservatives and liberals together in a room for 9 hours, 8 hours in a day, and basically have like a little workshop where they just do all of this stuff that you're talking about, and people leave completely transformed in their perception and made new friends and that kind of thing. And I personally would love to see in the integral movement this sort of communication become a standard practice, kind of like an integral life practice. You know, like everyone integral knows about shadow and shadow work and 3-2-1 and that kind of stuff and meditation. And I would love to see integral communication and conflict management becoming a standard practice that we could offer trainings or workshops or just something like that, you know?
That's a wonderful idea. Yeah, that's something I used to especially write and blog about a lot some years ago. Raimon Panikar being one of my inspirations in that area. He has, I think, some really powerful and good ideas in terms of, you know, he's known as one of the fathers of the interfaith movement, but he's not, in my view, he's definitely not green. I don't think, you know, I think he's an integrative thinker for sure, even though a lot of interfaith shows up in green ways. His thought and some of the tools that he develops are I think really profound and useful. And you know, for a long time I've wanted to see them show up more explicitly and robustly in the integral community. There was debates some years ago about, you know, with the new atheists and the way that they were taking on the religious community and the way that some, even in the integral community, were relating to the new atheists. Again, it didn't seem like a very productive way to go forward. And so I could see that, you know, the kind of processes I think we're both talking about, or the tools that Panikar has developed in his work, are, you know, essential tools, I think, for really integral culture making.
Mm. Yeah. Do you know? And you mentioned Marilyn Hamilton, who I think is she the one who does the integral city stuff?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know any other mainstream kind of big integral names out there who do? I know because I know Diane Musho Hamilton is like a facility, like does mediation, that kind of thing. I'm just wondering if you know of any other like mainstream integral names who are talking about similarly to what we're talking about here.
I know Adam Leonard is one. He was a co-author of the Integral Life Practice book, but his dissertation was on integral communication, and he's got basically a book on integral communication skills. And to my knowledge, it's been a few years since I communicated with him. To my knowledge, he's risen up pretty high in Google's management, and is basically using integral concepts and integral communication concepts that he developed in his dissertation in the Google organization. So I've definitely been, you know, interested to now that I've been doing integral stage, for instance, kind of to reconnect with him and maybe get his input. And if I am able to connect with him again, I'll point him your way too.
Awesome. Thank you. And before we start wrapping up here, I was just wondering, is there anything else you wanted to talk about or kind of get out there, or, you know, like, is there anything else you wanted to kind of share today?
I had a question just for you.
Sure.
Yeah, just one, are you thinking to bring the integral crossfire back if you have time? And what were the main kind of themes that you explored through that?
Yeah, so actually someone else took it over. One of the members named Charles, who is a philosopher, and he facilitates philosophy groups, so he's very good at doing that. But because I now work during the week, it's hard for me to find a time that works for me. But we explored a whole bunch of different themes. The first debate was on free will, which is a little bit more of a classical philosophical debate. And we did a few on kind of controversial topics, like we did one on racism, and then we did one on gender, And this was just like a group crossfire, so everyone is just kind of putting their perspective in there, throwing it into the pot. And then we did other crossfires specifically on integral topics, like I'm trying to remember, like, is green really a stage of development? I think was one. Other ones like are some stages, like higher stages better than lower ones, or that kind of thing, like hierarchy versus non-hierarchy. And so some of them were integral topics. Racism was my favorite one because I really wanted to get into cultural issues to train people in applying their leading edge integral consciousness to these issues that may not have been metabolized by people in an integral way yet.
Yes.
Right?
Great.
So my hope would be if I went back in there, my hope would be to just kind of go all in on cultural issues and just as our dojo for basically trying to transcend the culture wars.
That's a nice way to put it. I like that. Yeah, I think one topic that may be on the docket for the integral stage is the debate around race reparations. So I think be interesting to take that up. And I think David Hartful Jr., he's been writing on Black leadership and race issues. And I spoke with him a couple weeks ago. And as far as I know, he's preparing a video for the integral stage on the topic of race. So I'll let you know if that's going to be coming out soon.
Excellent. Awesome. So just my last question too is kind of like what is next for you? Like what if you had like a 5-year vision of the integral movement and kind of what you want to contribute or what direction you want to help it go in? Kind of what are you thinking up here? What are you dreaming up?
I've got a little bit of writing or things about to be published, and I'd like to really give more time to writing. Right now I'm just so busy I can't do it. But I would like to see now that, even though I started the integral stage on a lark, I'd like to see it become actually more stabilized and, provide more regular content, maybe even get some grants or whatever to support that and make it bigger than the little circle of friends that it now is, to foster, I think a fuller range of dialogue. So I'd like to see that. And really, long term, I've long had the vision of like creating an integral retreat and conference center. I have 2 projects that I've been kind of developed over the years in my mind. One is like the integral gym, kind of a local place where people go and exercise all of their dimensions. So it includes the body stuff, but also includes mind and spirit and art and all that kind of stuff. But the other, and I think some kind of center, a conference center, a retreat center where people can do different levels of work and different levels of social and spiritual encounter. I'd really love to build something like that. There's something called the Monastic Academy that I learned about recently that seems to be doing really cool work. And that's kind of in a spirit of something that I've been looking at for many years. So don't have the funds or the time to create it yet, but long term, if you're asking my fantasies, that's one of them. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's great. It's funny. I had the same idea with the integral gym. That was one of my dreams. I was envisioning like people exercising, and then there would be a room where you can like have brainwave sensors.
Yeah.
You're going in meditation and have different training exercises. And I also have a background in teaching martial arts and boxing and combat sports. So like having that and an integrally informed martial arts or something,
Wow.
But yeah.
Are you my brother from another mother? I don't know.
That's what I was going to ask, man. Oh man, this is great. One more other question too is if people wanted to participate in the integral stage, is it open to like the public? Should I contact you? Is it open to the public, or how does that work?
Definitely. Yeah, I'd like to encourage more than what's happening there now in terms of it's limited by the people I know. And I'd like it to be bigger than that. And if anybody's interested in participating on it or contributing something for it, they can email theintegralstage@gmail.com until I get a more official email address. That one will work. Or join the forum and message me. And I'll be happy to talk to them through Facebook too.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I know you've been really busy, Bruce, so I'm maybe more grateful that you're able to take the time to come on today. Well, thank you so much. This has been really a delightful conversation, and I really do look forward to collaborating with you more in the future.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, thanks very much. I enjoyed it.
Awesome, awesome. Well, thank you, and have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you soon.
All right, you too. All right, take care.
All right, take care.